Welcome to another Thursday with Third Path webinar. I know I say this every single time, but it's true. Again, we have an amazing webinar planned for you with someone who's really in close at Third Path and been doing so much to help us get our important message out to the world. And I think those who are listening in today will leave inspired about why change is possible right now and how the pandemic taught us that the changes we're suggesting really can help us live happier lives, have healthier families, have thriving organizations. So I'm really excited for you to listen in today and learn about how we can redesign our work to create an integrated approach to work and life. And before we get too far into the webinar, I want to make sure I explain what an integrated approach is, and then I'm going to have my guest, Bryn Jones, talk a little bit more about this. So what is work-life integration? I think the most important thing you're going to learn today is that people can redesign their work for all kinds of different reasons. We've given you just 6 examples on this slide. Michelle, who flexed her work around summers, taking almost 2 months off in the summers so that she could be present with her school-age kids. Or Ivan, who learned very late in life that he could also flex his work and started having Mondays with his granddaughter. There's lots of great stories, and we're going to talk more about them. The point is, all of them said, I want to do work and something else. So yes, this past year showed us that a lot of us could work more flexibly, meaning remotely, but that isn't the same as necessarily supporting integration. Because in order for Michelle and Ivan to create this integrated approach, they also had to get good about capacity management, meaning how much can they work, given that they want to do this and something else. They want to do work and care for a child, work and elder care, work and school, whatever it is that you want to integrate between work and something else. So flex is part of the solution, but getting smart about how much we can work is another important part of work-life integration. And we're going to talk more about this, including, if you look at the bottom of that slide, how our leaders in Third Path who learned about flex and capacity management brought all those skills into the pandemic this past year and helped their teams better manage the changes that happened over the course of the year. So flexibility is important, but so is capacity management if you want to live an integrated life. Welcome, Bryn. I am so glad to have you here. You know this personally, you know this professionally. You've got some great stories from your own experience around reaching for an integrated life and some of the obstacles that you've faced. So I feel like you're going to be a really great person to help us illustrate to this wonderful group listening in today around how they too can make some changes, what are some of the obstacles, how they can overcome those obstacles. And as you listen in to folks today, as you're listening to Bryn and I talk about this, keep track of your questions, put them in the chat room. We definitely want to answer them as we get to the end of today's webinar. So welcome, Bryn. What has living an integrated life meant for you? Why has it been good for you, good for your family, good for the work you do? What other advice would you already give people about living an integrated life, Bryn?
Wow. Thanks, Jessica. Those are some really big questions to start us off with. Well, so thinking about what an integrated life means to me, I have 2 sons. Both are still pretty young. One is 10 and one is 8. And when my oldest was born is when I really began thinking about these questions. I had thought about them earlier on in life, but that moment when I had a new baby, it became a real focus of mine. And what it boiled down to is that I wanted to be able to do meaningful work in life and also be fully present with my kids. And fully present isn't just about time for me, it's also about energy and focus. I wanted to be with my kids when I was with my kids. It has led to a number of decisions for me over time. One of those decisions was to leave the organization that I was a CEO of and start my own business. It has looking really closely at not only how much I'm working, but how I'm working. So trying to get smarter about how I use my time. It's also meant really paying attention to my energy and how I use it, how I get it, how I restore it, how I have it with my kids when I'm with them, and how I get to have time for myself to recharge. So there's lots of pieces to those questions, and I'm not sure I've fully answered your questions, but that's kind of
you did.
what comes to mind.
No, you did a perfect job. I love that you focused right in on energy and focus, because I think that's one of the unexpected benefits that I've observed from people who live an integrated life. Because over the last 20 years, we've been helping people do this, but over the last 20 years, what also changed was how many things could distract us. We live in a world now where both at work and at home, we could constantly be distracted by 1,000 different things. And I think what happens is people who are trying to live this integrated life become very intentional about, I want to create time and energy for X and the other thing, and therefore they are better at kind of choosing how to use that time when they're there to be focused on those things. So we're going to come back to this concept of focus and why I think, it's actually very connected to the next one of the slides I'm going to put up shortly about boundary setting, but it's also very connected to that thing I was mentioning about capacity management, that we can only do so much. And so I think integrated people get very good at saying, well, what do I want to have time for? There's a couple of things I want to show about this slide that I was putting up earlier, Bryn. Once I share these couple of thoughts, I wonder what you think about them too. Third Path has been very careful about making sure this is something that becomes a men's and women's issue. And so as we've gone out there trying to help people understand that they can live an integrated life, we've really tried to loudly and proudly point out this can be something men and women both do. I want to talk about Roger for a second. I know you know his story. It says right here that he realized, like his wife, he could also work reduced hours. So, one of the things we've been talking about is that, along came the baby, you realized you wanted to be able to have time with the baby and time to do work. And I think sometimes what happens is women are thinking these thoughts, and we're forgetting that, if we happen to be partnered with a man, he could be thinking these thoughts too. And so there's a role that parents can play in helping them, each other, whether it's two moms or two dads, together think about, we can both follow an integrated approach. And when we do that, there's a lot of advantages. Now, you've been doing this for a while, as co-parents, getting through the pandemic. Anything you feel like you learned before the pandemic happened, that you and your co-parent around how to make this work, that turned out to be useful as you were getting through the pandemic?
Well, yeah, it's certainly been a year of learning opportunities. So just to be clear, as you're talking about me as a co-parent, I am divorced.
Right.
And
sorry. Yes.
No, I just want to be clear for anyone listening. So I am divorced, and my ex-husband and I share 50-50 time with our kids. And it's very important for both of us to be as involved in our kids' lives as possible. And so it's been a lot of conversation. And for me, because we're not married anymore, those conversations obviously have changed over time. And so for me, it's regularly checking in with what do I want this to look like? What does it look like? Where are the gaps? What are the possibilities to open up some options? And I think that's been one of the most critical skills for me, is just being able to open up options. It can often feel like, man, there's no choice here. Like I have to do this one way, but there's almost always more than one way to do things. And so just really being able to step back and say, okay, what is possible here? And for us, like one of the things that has really helped us is my ex-husband's mom is retired and in town, and she also wanted to be a part of her grandkids' lives. So she has helped us as our kids have been in remote learning for the past year. She's helped take some of the time while they're in school so that we can both work. And we just really, we experimented. We tried some things, they didn't work. We tried something else. So I think that experimentation is also really a really important skill to have and cultivate.
Yes,
Yeah.
wonderful. Yeah, no, really good example. And in fact, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you share that part of your story of how you and your ex have co-parented together is because it is such a great example of how we can keep on thinking differently, looking for possibilities. And we're going to circle back to what Bryn talked about, which is often what gets in the way of people moving forward with an integrated approach is the fear that there's some reason why it can't be done. And, Bryn's going to talk a little bit about how we can help ourselves imagine the possibility more, and open ourselves up to those ideas that are out there if we take the time to reflect and think about them. Because there really are, each of us faces a challenge. For me, there's just always been too much work to do, and how do I handle that? And stepping back and reflecting helps us come up with some answers that might not have been so obvious to begin with. So wonderful. And, at the root of it, no surprise, in my humble opinion, is this concept of boundary setting. In this case, it might be two parents who share the kids who are married, or it might be, parents plus extended family who are sharing care in some other way. All of the options are there's so many different ways of people setting boundaries around work and family responsibilities. It's just kind of exciting to think about all the different ways it can happen. But either way, what happens is that, parents are good at saying, I want to have time for work and these other things. And if you're going to do work plus something else, you need to be good at boundary setting. Not rigid and not too flexible. You need to be able to be firm and flexible in how you set boundaries so you can create time for work, create time for these other priorities. And what we're going to talk about in a minute is how boundary setting can feel a little bit risky. How important has boundary setting been for you, Bryn? Can you think of some times when it's felt more challenging, or a time when you really learned something around it? Or maybe with one of your clients that you saw, because you do a lot of help of parents trying to think about these issues every day. Any thoughts about boundary setting?
Oh, I think that this is one of the most important skills that you can have. And the past 10 years, I've learned a heck of a lot about boundary setting in my own life and with my clients. So my clients are many of them are working parents, and most of them are also executives and leaders in organizations. And so they are balancing really big work plates with desires to have life outside of work also. And I think this is one of the more challenging skill sets for people. I hear a lot, and I know this was hard for me too in the beginning. I have to say no to something. In order to be able to say yes, I have to be able to say no to something else. And that feels risky, especially when you are sort of bucking the way things have always been. And so I think one of the most useful things for me in my learning, and one of the things I bring to my coaching, is that we train people, whether or not we're intentionally creating boundaries or not. The boundaries that we live by are training others in how they interact with us. And so if we want to really start aligning our lives with our values, then we need to look at how our boundaries do that or don't do that for us. So for me in the beginning, it was really around learning how to say no in a way that, like, I didn't have to explain myself to everyone. I could say no without projecting my assumptions about what they were thinking about that no, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And I did this a lot around my schedule. I got really, really good at setting boundaries with how I use my time, blocking out times where I could work quietly and get stuff done. So, that was a tool in working smarter. I need to have that time where I can really focus in and get things done. And then, having some boundaries around when I meet with people, boundaries around my time with my family, all of those, I think of those as my scheduling rules, and they all connect to some larger goal of how I'm working and living.
Yeah. Oh, so many wise things. I love the point you've made about that you're actually, whether you're conscious or not, training people every day around how you handle boundaries. And so by being smart about, training them in the right way. So for example, I think people who've listened on Mondays, I really try to map out most of Monday to be a quiet, focused work day. And if I'm not careful and I let things slip onto Monday, then I'm not going to have my quiet, focused work day. But I've learned that if I have my quiet, focused work day first thing in the week, for me, that helps me feel like I've gotten to my most important things. And if the rest of the week gets crazy, at least I moved something forward that was really important to me. So, yay, I'm so glad that you are conscious of them and supporting people to think about them and understanding that sometimes we need to say no in order to have the time and energy for the things that are most important to us. One other source of risk, and you've kind of hinted at this with some of the people that you work with, certainly it's something we've seen. All of those pioneering stories I told you at the beginning of this webinar are from people who did not necessarily work in a supportive workplace. In fact, we call a number of work cultures work first work cultures. The idea is that, if you want to get ahead in this culture, you need to put work first. And it's, demonstrated in all kinds of subtle and not so subtle ways across the board, all the way to the top of the organization, especially perhaps at the top of the organization, where the expectation is that, you're going to be available 24/7, you're going to be available evenings, weekends, and maybe even on vacations. And for you to set boundaries around that might mean that you really feel like you might jeopardize moving ahead in your career. Now, you're going to see a little bit later the Third Path Leader Guide that you can download and read about real life stories of people who moved ahead in their careers and set boundaries. But this is what we want to get on the table right ahead of this conversation, is that, we can feel intimidated by our work cultures around doing this. Before we get too much further into this conversation, any advice that you've learned that helps people, push back at cultures that are expecting a lot, or advice that you've given to people around what do you do when you're in a work first work culture and you want to set boundaries? Anything, lessons learned you've had, Bryn?
Yeah, I've actually been thinking a lot about this the past couple of days as leading up to this conversation, and I come at this from some different perspectives. So, I was a CEO before starting my own business, and I coach a lot of CEOs and members in the C-suite. And when I was a CEO, I was actually the one wanting to see culture change. I headed up an organization that was very entrenched in a work first culture, and realized even when the CEO wants to make change, if there isn't support around them, it can be very hard. So, in thinking about the little wins I had during that time, it was through building relationships with others in the organization, and first even like connecting with others who had some similar thoughts to me. These thoughts can be throughout an organization of, man, we could do things differently. But if people aren't talking about them, then you feel very alone. Like, I'm the only one that's having these thoughts. And that's really evident to me in a lot of the CEOs I coach. They have the same thoughts. Like, I want to lead differently. I want my workplace to be differently, but I don't know where to start, and I don't know how to do it. And it feels really risky to me because I have a whole board that, oversees me. And so the CEOs I coach, and I certainly found this helpful when I was one. I lead some peer coaching groups where CEOs can have these conversations with each other and not feel so weird for having the thoughts that they're having. To have the conversations in the organization explicitly, and I think this is cultural change, and so talking about organizational culture in a very explicit way, acknowledging the way things are and maybe the way things you want them to be. And you may not be in a place where you can have that big of an effect on organizational culture, but you can certainly be forming relationships with people on your team and in your organization and thinking about how the way you want to do things differently can help the organization. And Third Path always talks about the triple win, and I think that's such an important thing, is being able to think about the changes that you want to see from how they're going to be good for you, how they're going to be good for your team, and how they're going to be good for the organization. And being able to see those multiple perspectives and think about them before asking for any sort of change is really important.
Yeah. Oh, such good insights. Again, just underscoring what I'm hearing you say, don't do this alone would be the biggest message. Don't do this alone. And there's lots of ways to build relationships around you so that you can find support and acknowledgement that what you're looking for is actually good for the organization, because that's the second takeaway. It's not what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today, but, when we encourage people to think about an integrated approach, we're not saying do a bad job at work. We're saying, how can you do your work excellently and create time for your life? And what we've seen over and over again is they actually often find ways to improve how they get work done. And if you tune into the February webinar we had, it's up on our website. You can listen to very concrete case studies about how when people set boundaries, they think about work and something else, they actually really can improve the work. And so don't do it alone. Remember that it's a way to improve how your organization can actually function better. Get some support. Start in small places, like this idea of start with a team. These are all great ideas. And I think that peer coaching that you're doing is so important. We see that at Third Path too. When you bring some leaders together and you encourage them to think this way, they see how they're going to benefit from this. They hear each other's stories, and it really inspires them that change is possible. There's one other method people can use that we're going to talk about next, which is, we've really learned a place you can begin is, even though you want to go to work and have a change at work, a place you can begin is actually to start at home. And, whether that's you and, you're a single parent and you want to think about how to do things differently, and you have a close friend or relative that you can talk to and say, hey, how do I do this differently? Or you're part of a two-parent household, or for example, what Bryn's done this past year of kind of figuring out with her ex about how to make things work. The clearer you are about what you're trying to do on the family side of things, on the home side of things, it helps you then get clear about how to make a change at work. I'm going to give you a couple examples of this. If you're, for example, some of those stories that you'll read about if you download our Third Path Leader Guide, you would see that, for example, Michelle, who went to a flex year schedule, she didn't get a lot of support to begin with, but what she did have was support at home and clarity about this is what we wanted to do. We want to figure out, she had a very busy tax season where her husband took the majority of the family care responsibilities. And she knew that by cutting back in the summers and having more time with family, not only was it what she wanted to do, she'd come back to the next year of work more recharged. So it was a good rhythm for her family to he helped out a lot on tax season, she helped out a lot in the summer. They both got through the rest of the year kind of in a joint way. It was healthy for their family to do that. And that clarity at home helped her overcome some of those bumps along the road around how to make this schedule work for the long run. Um, so, it's both parents, again, living together or apart, being skilled at saying, how can I do my job differently so I have time for these other responsibilities? And what we're going to talk about in a little bit, how can we afford our solution? Because that can also be a challenge. So have you seen that in some of the people you've worked with, that having that conversation at home, Roger remembering, hey, I can change things just like my wife, and the two of them talking together makes a stronger ability to ask for changes at work. Is that something you've seen too, Bryn?
Oh, indeed. And I think usually that conversation starts with self. Um,
Yep,
and
yep,
and getting some clarity yourself before, and third path has some great worksheets to do this on. I'm thinking of the North Star
yep,
handout, and be using that to get clear on yourself what's important, and then your partner can do it if you have one, and then you can look at those together, having some things like that to help have a conversation. Because it can be hard for couples to have these conversations when they're also used to doing things a certain way, or they're used to, I was thinking about how we often let the work expectations, or just the cultural expectations around us, work or not work, those are driving the car, and we're not even questioning who's driving the car. So it's about getting into the driver's seat ourselves. And that can be uncomfortable, and so having those conversations with your partner can feel uncomfortable also, but so necessary. If you want to think about how your work is going to change, you need to be clear on why you want that change in the first place. So yeah, I think that's really
yeah,
important.
yeah. And I love your point. What a thank you for reminding everybody, including me. It starts with yourself, right? So you're listening in today. You're thinking about how things have been this past year. You're thinking ahead about what do you want next year to look like, hopefully with the world returning more to a normal place. Um, that's the great place to begin. What do you want? What have you learned this year? When you think about next year, what do you want it to look like next year? Talking to a friend, talking to one of Third Path ILAs, talking to a person like Bryn, find out, what are you looking for? Then sitting down and talking to your partner about how can we both do this together. Um, and, remembering that there can be the short or longer range perspective on how you make some changes, because kids keep on changing. So you can keep on looking for solutions as kids get older. But the other important point I want to talk about, and maybe if, after I share the story, if you have some thoughts or experiences around helping dads in particular, men ask for change, you know, people forget men and women can redesign their work. And so on that February webinar, we had CJ join us. And we met CJ 10 years ago because he wanted to go to a 4-day work week and have that fifth day for family time. And what was interesting, if you go listen to that February webinar, is that you'll hear CJ talk about a classic problem we've seen, which is, over time, he kept on doing such a great job on his 4-day schedule. He was being groomed to run his team. And he talks about how he felt like he was at this crossroad again on that February webinar about, hey, they want me to move into a position of leadership, but I still like working 4 days a week. Can I do this? And of course, we wanted to have CJ talk about this because yes, you can. That's our whole point in that Third Path Leader Guide, is that we can help people, not just when they're individual contributors work differently, but even as leaders, continue to model an integrated approach. Men and women can both make changes, can keep on committing to those changes over time, and that there's so many benefits to the organization when people learn how to do work redesign right in a moment and over the long run. So when you think about maybe words of encouragement or a story that you've seen about supporting both men and women to think about work redesign, what comes to your mind, Bryn? What have you seen around that?
Well, honestly, what's coming to mind is, I certainly see a desire in men as much as in women to set these boundaries and have more more availability for their life and their kids outside of work. And so one of my clients that is coming to mind right now is a man who's also very aware that as a man in his organization in a high leadership position, that the choices that he's making is also modeling for others and setting the stage for others. So his own challenges in figuring out how to do this, he's connecting to, this is also setting the stage for women in the organization to be able to do the same thing. So it's a very holistic look that he's taking to the change that he's trying to make in his own personal life, and then pushing that out to this is what it can mean for the organization.
Oh, that's so great, and it's so true. It's hugely powerful when men make changes like this, and when we have leaders and men make changes like this. That's wonderful. And what we're going to get to a little bit later in this webinar is a real case study of somebody who's struggling with this right now, a dad who wants to figure out how to keep on working remotely, even though what he's seeing is his kind of old guard leaders wanting to return to the office. And we're going to talk a little bit about how can we support men and women to keep on, asking for change, looking for ways to continue to work in a way that makes sense for them, and why that's going to be good for them and their organizations. Well, one obvious way that this is true is because people really develop some important skills. That's, again, we did not know this when we set off 20 years ago trying to help people think about work-life integration. But it turns out in a world where we could work everywhere all the time, we could be constantly distracted, pulled in 10 directions. When you follow this integrated approach, you get really good at some profoundly important skills in today's world. All of the ones outlined here are talking about how you get better at kind of thinking ahead about what you need to do, planning for that to make sure you have time, not just letting email or technology overwhelm your lives, but instead using it more strategically. Self-discipline, for example, that idea that, hey, sometimes we got to actually say no. Quiet work time, you heard Bryn talk about that, and me, this ability to kind of actually create some focused work time. And of course, it all evolves around this concept of boundary setting. Any of these skills been surprising to you or especially important to help people learn about when you work with parents and working parents? Any of these that you found especially important or surprising?
Well, I have to say that I think I immediately go to self-discipline, and just for full disclosure, I am in the process of becoming a certified mindfulness meditation teacher, and so mindfulness is hugely beneficial from my perspective. But I find myself on that path to become a mindfulness teacher because those skills of being able to really be with what is and slow down and train ourselves to be present to what is there in front of us, then gives us the space to open up to what is possible and think about how to face challenges ahead of us. So the self-discipline I think is really huge, and it's something that, all of these are learnable, right? They're muscles that we have, and we just learn how to build those muscles and flex them as needed.
Yeah. In fact, thank you for that point, because I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, some of the leaders we worked with said, man, we should be able to figure out how to teach these skills earlier in people's careers, get them thinking in an integrated way earlier in their career. So we launched those overwhelm mitigation calls that we mentioned on the slide, and that's exactly what we try to do in them. Bryn actually has helped us run some of those calls at different times. And it's the idea that by having someone show up at a call once a month for an entire year, yes, we're teaching them something important, but in some ways what we're teaching them is keep on practicing, keep on experimenting, notice where it's not working, and then try again. And by showing up once a month, for a whole year, we hope that, we've helped them develop some skills that will stick with them long past the overwhelm mitigation groups. So we've talked a lot about a bunch of different things. And again, I hope you're sending in your questions. We want to make sure we have time at the end to answer them. I hope we've given you a big picture that, work-life integration is something you can do. Boundary setting is critical to it. You'll develop some really great skills when you get smarter at work-life integration. And by the way, you'll never stop learning. I've been doing this for a long, long time, and every year I learn something new around how to do it better. One of the big obstacles is when people feel like they can't afford to make the change. And by the way, I am not naive. There are many families where we need much better public policy to make what Third Path believes in available to everybody. So I am aware that we have a long ways to go as a society to make this affordable to all. But there are some families where, there might be a way to think differently about finances that might help them overcome that hurdle, that fear that somehow finances makes it impossible for them to think differently around work-life integration. So we have this little visual to kind of, say it in a short summary, but, some families can get, in a two-parent household, both are working a lot, they just don't have much time. Or, some families might not be working enough and they have too much time. Or sometimes what can happen is one person works a lot, the other one's the flexible one, and so they're the only one who's really doing the integrated approach, and there can sometimes be frustration around that. And so what we're trying to help families think about together is how can we do this, what can we do as a family system to really think about our work-life integration goals, and how does money play into this? And again, we have some information in our Third Path Leader Guide about this, and we've seen some key things around that will help people. I'm going to talk about them in a second and get Bryn's thoughts. Most importantly, if you want a great resource about how to think about work, family, and money, check out our blog right now on our website, because we had Matt Becker share some insights around work, life, family, and money on one of our webinars, and we have that up on our current blog post. You can even just search Third Path Across the Life Cycle on your web browser right now, and you'll find that blog post. So money can get us, as you said early in the conversation, Bryn, can get us to start thinking smaller, feeling like we have limited choices. What I want to talk about for a second right now is how can we think broader? How can we expand our sources, our thoughts around how to make this happen? Think bigger about what are our possibilities around money. I'll say two things, and I want to hear your thoughts about this afterwards. One is that I think what I've seen a pattern in integrated in families where both are thinking in an integrated way is that they value time and money. So they're not always saying, let's just get the job with the bigger paycheck. They're saying, that job is a bigger paycheck and it also requires a lot of time. Is there some way we can think differently about this so we can value time and money? And that what we've seen also in families is that they think about the whole family. So yes, maybe one person earns more money than the other person, but as a family system, do they have enough money? Do they have enough time? And so it's not so much about who's earning the money or who's earning the more money. It's more like, what does our family need? And how can we set it up so that we both have time with family and earn the money that the family needs? Does any of that ring bells for you, Bryn? What else have you learned about work, family, and money?
Oh, I mean, yeah, you're ringing all sorts of bells. I think this is a very real thing, and when money is stretched thin, it does certainly feel like it limits options, and sometimes it really does in real ways.
Yep.
It's interesting to be having this conversation right now. I don't think I've told you this, Jessica, but a couple months ago, someone presented me with a CEO position for an organization that was very interesting to me. And I very surprisingly found myself considering it. And part of the reason why I was considering it was I would be bringing in a lot more money and have benefits covered and all of those things that, I pay for myself as a business owner. Um, but when I really sat with it, I thought about, I know what it means to be a CEO, and I know how that would affect my life and my time with my kids. And I landed so squarely on, yeah, the money, the having more money and freedom within that would be really nice. But I'm not willing to give up. Like I am so clear on how I want to be present with my family, that it wasn't too hard for me to land on, no, that's not right for me, even though the work was really, really intriguing to me. So,
Yeah.
I talk about this all the time, personally and professionally, like in organizations, your budget is a reflection of your values and goals. And I think that we forget that how we spend our money, how we allocate our money, really reflects what we want to get out of work or life. So I think that's, going back to the North Star and all of that. The budget is part of the planning for those
Yeah.
goals and values.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh, Bryn, thank you for sharing that. That's such a perfect example of how we can help people expand the options when they're thinking about this. Because again, I've been doing this for too long. It's certainly a story I've heard over and over again. We don't know that, for example, that option that Bryn just talked about, it's going to happen again. There's going to be some other option when Bryn's a little bit further along, her kids are a little bit older. She's going to continue to be this excellent, smart resource that people are going to want to get involved with what they're doing. And it's hard to know that at that moment, but what she did there was say, but my kids are my kids' age at this moment in time, and I can't get that back. And so we've seen that over and over again with our integrated, professionals who've gone on to leadership positions. All of them include a moment in time where they were offered something a little bit earlier, a little bit too time demanding, and they said, you know what, not right now, maybe later, because time and money are both important. Their kids are growing up. Life goes by fast. Thank you. That story was perfect. There might be one more thought you want to share about money. Otherwise, I'm going to talk a little bit about this case study that we're going to go on to, and we're getting close to wrapping up around encouraging people to think big around some things. Any last thoughts about money?
No, I think let's move on.
Yeah. Well, I put this case study up because I think it's connected to money. Often what can happen, not always, because there's more and more families where mom's got the big job and dad's the flexor. So this is not uniform across the board. But in too many families, when there is, I think it can play out with either parent is the primary earner, that parent can feel more stuck in the situation that they're in, to make change. And that's why, again, going back to having families think as a whole family about what your goals are might give people more opportunities to think differently. So what's going on in this true case study? I'm afraid this case study is probably being played out across the country right now. There's, men and women who have really enjoyed working remotely and actually saw that it was improving their happiness with their families and their partners at home and their kids, and they spent less time commuting. This dad was even talking about how he could see it improved his productivity. So there was no downside. Everything was better, that he was able to include remote work as part of his solution this past year. He was living a better life because of this. But now he's seeing that his, old guard leaders are dying to return to the office. And because of the kind of organization he's in, more of a work-first workplace, he feels like he's got to do what the bosses are doing, if he's going to be considered serious for his job. We have on our website right now a simple solution that people could turn to, and I'm going to ask Bryn if she has a more sophisticated solution, but we do have a little survey you can use to kind of assess how well you've been working remotely this past year and why it's been good for your job and good for your, yourself and your organization. And you can complete the survey as a way to kind of maybe give yourself some tools to talk about why remote work has not compromised your ability to work effectively, and that might help you in your conversation with your boss. But Bryn, any other thoughts about how to empower dads and moms, men and women, to continue to ask for what they need, even if their bosses are kind of returning to the old back to the office approach?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a challenge. The old way of doing things can be a really strong motivator, especially when people are seeking to go back to some level of comfort after a year of high anxiety.
Yes. Yep.
I think what's coming to me, just thinking about the leaders that I work with, and again, the peer groups are such a helpful thing because leaders get to hear other leaders thinking through this type of thing. But if that doesn't exist, then I think at this point there's a wealth of information out there about not only how more organizations are adopting different ways of doing things, but how it's really effective and helping the organization do work better. I'm thinking I would gather, if I were in that position, I would gather up some of that information to help build my case and again show that it's not just about me, but I'm thinking about how this helps the organization.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm thinking back to what you said early on too. He's probably not the only person who's feeling like, and that maybe there's a way to, find that one other person, and not in a proactive, thoughtful way, reach out to one of the leaders and say, hey, we're thinking about this and we'd like to partner with you in thinking about this, and we can get you some resources to help us all, all learn more about this. So it's like, in an inviting way, starting an educational process of what could be, what's possible, and to maybe use some of Bryn's advice of finding one other person to help you in that process as you think ahead about this. The point being, equip yourself, get some information out there, lots of information about how remote work can be very effective, and having it in dialogue, in relationship with people. Maybe you can learn what their fears are and start figuring out how to address those. Any other advice you'd give to this dad?
Yes, actually, as you were talking, the thing that came to me, and one of the things that I have so loved about Third Path and learned through Third Path is the idea of experimentation. We've touched on it a couple of times today.
Yep.
But I think especially as you're wanting to try things out with leaders in different ways, they're uncomfortable with that too. And so approaching it from the perspective of, hey, can we try this out and see how it works? And then, after a period of time, reflect on it together and see how it's going and adjust as necessary. That takes the risk level down a little, in that we are not agreeing to something forever right now, not knowing what that's really going to be like. And so experimentation and reflection and adaptation, I think, are really important.
Yeah. And in fact, it's kind of weird to think of it as a pilot period because we just all were remote for this entire year. But it's almost we've always talked about pilot periods. And so maybe it's saying to that, finding that person who's excited about it, finding that leader who's willing to talk to you about it and saying, hey, could we see what we could do for the next 6 months, setting up sort of a, here's how we could kind of roll it out for the next 6 months, check in, and here's the worry you have, and we can see if that worry's come to fruition, or, because of these points, I can work better. Other organizations are succeeded this way. So it's equipping people to get smarter about it over time and experimenting together over time. Wonderful. Yay. All right. Well, we hope that encourages you to start thinking about, if you're hitting some walls at work, how to overcome those walls. There's one other thing that I think was a really great point Bryn asked me to add to this webinar today, which I think says so much. It's the truth that we're on this journey for a while. It's not like you figure out work-life integration and boom, you're done. I guarantee there are going to be moments in time when you're still confused about what you need to do and how to make a change. Bryn, so tell us a little bit about what you've learned around sitting with uncertainty and why this is such an important part of adopting an integrated approach.
Yeah, well, as you and I were talking about this over the last week or so, I was just really thinking what has been really hard for me as I, stepped into claiming an integrated life with just claiming it like I want this is can feel really risky. Like there's a lot of risk involved in stepping out and doing things in a different way. And with that risk is kind of coupled with uncertainty. You don't know what's going to happen, and you are putting some things on the line by wanting to do things differently and speaking to that. And so, one of the most valuable things that I learned in sitting with uncertainty is actually, so the last point about checking assumptions and reframing our thinking. So we are hardwired with a negativity bias. We naturally think about the worst thing that could happen in a situation and then plan to that instead of balancing that with, okay, here's the worst case, that might happen, and here's the best case, and that could happen too. And doing that on a regular basis really helped me move more from a place of planning from fear to a place of planning for what I want, and really feeling empowered. And certainly, obviously, I've already talked about becoming a mindfulness teacher. I think slowing down enough to give ourselves the space to be with all the discomfort and let it be there. And also getting that space to step back and allow ourselves to dream of what could be. I think those are all really important.
Yeah, wonderful. I love that, to remember that, give our space to think about, yes, this bad thing could happen, but what could be? What is the possibilities here too? And, creating some real room for both those things. Wonderful, wonderful. And, again, yes, some risk, but I hope what you can hear in Bryn's story and my story, all the stories we've been telling you today, the outcome of reaching for these goals is quite powerful. Living a life where you've really been able to, be excellent at work, but also create time for these things that are so important to you. It's really quite a delightful life. It's what gives me energy to keep on doing what we do at Third Path, because I feel it really does help us live a very wonderful life. So don't forget, we've been telling you in all of our webinars that you can download this free copy of our Third Path Leader Guide. You can find it on the free resources section of our website. It's got a lot of information that we've reviewed today around how you can create this integrated life, and, sort of the first steps you can take as you reach for this goal. We're getting close to the end, so we're going to be asking people for questions soon around, maybe how a next step they want to learn about how they can make a change, maybe a challenge they're facing either at work or at home on how to create an integrated life. So I'm going to check with Sergio in a second and see if anybody's written in a question or has a comment that they want to share with us. And Sergio is going to read your first name and then read that question or thought out loud. Sergio, any luck right now with some questions or thoughts out there for Bryn or for me?
Yes, we do have a question from Lindsay, and it says, I am thinking about this point you are all making about planning and prioritizing. I have more control than my husband over when I have meetings or phone calls, but my husband doesn't have too much control over this element of his work. He has way too many phone calls, meetings, which he knows. Is there a way you recommend planning for this and even lessening this burden when you're not in primary control of your calendar?
That is a great question. And Bryn, I'm going to ask you for your thoughts in 2 seconds. I just want to say something funny. I think this is the big outcome of the pandemic. I think I've heard so many people talk about how they spent their entire week on Zoom meetings and unplanned meetings and phone calls, and that they just have no time to even get their work done because the day's been so cluttered with all these Zoom meetings and meetings. So I think there's a real, although there was some problems with that before with too many face-to-face meetings. Bryn, I'm going to think for a second about what advice I give, but any advice you give to the problem of, having a partner who doesn't seem to have, works in a workplace where there's not a lot of control over the schedule. And any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about it from a couple of different angles. I can relate to, even though I'm no longer married to my ex-husband, he is certainly a big part of the equation in my family, and he has way less control over his schedule than I do. And so part of that for us is just talking through, okay, if this is the reality and we're going to continue to accept this as the reality, so that's part of it, like, is this an acceptable part of our reality? But if it is, then how do we adjust how we do things to accommodate that? And then, thinking about it from a work perspective, if it's not an acceptable reality, I've definitely worked with emerging leaders and organizations that don't have that control over their schedule, and at the same time have so wanted to change that so that they can be present with their families. It takes very intentional conversations with their supervisors. And really, going back to that experiment, can we try some new rules? I know a number of organizations in the pandemic that have gone to everybody's wiped out on Zoom. And so they've tried some things like no meeting Mondays or no meeting Fridays, or, we all get quiet work time Wednesday afternoons, or whatever it is. So, it's a common feeling probably, I would imagine, throughout his organization. And so maybe there's some more creative, again, reaching out to other people in the organization. Maybe some creative ideas could emerge how to handle those challenges.
Yeah, I think I see a theme here. The message I would say is, nobody's working at their best when their days are full of tons of meetings, and unless that is actually how you get your work done, right? It could be that you have a job where that's what you do, and so you're actually getting your work done that way. But if impromptu meetings are consuming your day, and there's other work you're not getting to, and it feels dysfunctional in your ability to get your work done, then, it's that same thing we were talking about, this guy who could do remote work. It was highly functional to do remote work, but, the old norms are getting in the way of this different way of approaching work. So again, the frame is, this is about how to do work better. It's remembering that we're asking people to think about, how can we do work better? And it sounds like we're using the same process every time. Who else in that work group realizes that the way we're doing work right now is not working so well? How can I partner with them? How can I then start building a conversation around how we could all work better? Who else is interested in figuring out some more appropriate ways to approach meetings, etc., creating some norms that help us work better? I'll end with one last story. I think integrated people are become very passionate about wasting time and spending too much time in meetings, and they get pretty smart about speaking up around the problem. And I'm thinking about this one leader who stood up in a meeting of 50 high executives at his organization and said, "Look who's in this room today and how much time we're spending in this meeting. How expensive is this for our organization, for all of us to be here? Is this the best use of our time?" And I was like, wow.
Nice.
So it does take some, you don't have to be the person who stands up in that meeting and says that, but it's remembering organizations benefit when people find a safe and smart way to question bad work habits and adopt better work habits. What a great question. There might be one last thought you want to add to that, Bryn, and we'll see if Sergio has one other question out there for us. Any other thoughts you want to add, Bryn?
No, I think you made some really good points there.
Great. Sergio, any other questions out there before we get close to the ending of our webinar today?
No more questions.
Well, that's good because it's the time for us to actually come to a close. So again, I knew this was going to be a great webinar. I hope what you've been hearing from both Bryn and I is that, dream big. Take time to dream big about what you want from work and life. Remember that when you do this, it will actually likely find ways to improve how you get your work done. You'll become more effective at work and happier with the solution you've created, both on the work and life side. Bryn, is there any last thoughts you want to share? Thank you so much for being here today and sharing your wisdom.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Jessica, always. I think dreaming certainly is one of the closing thoughts that I wanted to touch on, and you've already done that. So I guess the only other thing I would emphasize that maybe I didn't emphasize earlier as much as I would have liked is that being able to listen to others as you try to figure out new ways is really important. To hear when we talk about working with teams and organizations, it's as important to hear where their concerns are and what their hopes are as it is to come to the table with yours. So remember to listen also.
Oh, that's such good parting advice. I think I've always gotten to a better answer by doing a lot of listening, Bryn. That's brilliant. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So, hey, everybody, thank you very much for a wonderful webinar. And please remember to follow us on social media. You'll get to hear about the next webinars coming up, when you can listen to the YouTube version of our webinars. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. What a great webinar.